17th of August, 1943, Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Germany. The morning sky over southern England was clear and pale, washed by a light wind from the west. On airfields stretching from East Anglia to the Midlands, ground crews moved with practiced speed beneath the wings of hundreds of heavy bombers. The aircraft were Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, four-engined machines of aluminum and steel, each weighing more than 30 tons when fully loaded. They stood nose to tail along concrete runways and grass dispersals, their olive-drab skins dull in the early light. Inside briefing rooms, the mood was tense and quiet. Crews studied maps that showed a long red line stretching deep into the heart of Germany. The targets were circled in grease pencil. Regensburg, home to the Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter works, and Schweinfurt, where ball bearings critical to the German war economy were produced. The distance was unprecedented, more than 500 miles one way. The bombers would fly beyond the range of Allied fighter escort for most of the mission. For months, German commanders had dismissed the American daylight bombing campaign as reckless and unsustainable. They believed no force of heavy bombers could survive deep penetration without fighter cover. Losses, they were certain, would force the Americans to abandon daylight raids, just as others had before them. This morning would test that belief. At 5:45 a.m., engines began to turn. One by one, propellers blurred into silver discs. The noise rolled across the countryside like distant thunder. Pilots eased throttles forward, and the first aircraft lifted heavily into the air, wheels folding away as it climbed into formation. By the time the last bomber took off, more than 370 B-17s were airborne, forming vast combat boxes at altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet. Above the clouds, sunlight flashed on plexiglass noses and spinning propellers. Below them lay the English Channel, then occupied Europe, then Germany itself. The 8th Air Force had been flying combat missions over Europe since August 1942. Early raids were small, cautious, and often experimental. But by mid-1943, American commanders believed they had proven a theory that many in Europe doubted, that tightly formed groups of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves without fighter escort. Each B-17 carried up to 13.50 caliber machine guns, covering nearly every angle of approach. The aircraft flew close enough that their overlapping fields of fire created what crews called a moving fortress. German airmen had a different name for it. They called it a flying porcupine. At first, the Luftwaffe had underestimated the threat. In 1942 and early 1943, German fighter pilots often attacked individually, diving through formations at high speed. Losses were heavy. As American numbers increased, German tactics evolved. Fighters now attacked in coordinated waves, head-on, where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest and closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour. Specialized weapons appeared: 20mm and 30mm cannons, rockets, even heavy twin-engined fighters designed specifically to break bomber formations. On this August morning, German radar stations along the coast detected the incoming force. Reports moved rapidly through the command chain. Fighter units were alerted. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulfs Fw-190s took off from fields across France and Germany, climbing hard to intercept. The first attacks came shortly after the bombers crossed the German border. From the perspective of the bomber crews, the enemy appeared suddenly, dark shapes rising out of the sun, growing larger by the second. Tracers arced through the air. Cannon shells exploded against fuselages and wings. One B-17 shuddered as a shell tore through its nose, killing the bombardier instantly. Another caught fire and fell out of formation, spinning slowly before disappearing into the clouds below. Inside the bombers, temperatures were far below freezing. Oxygen masks hissed steadily. Gunners tracked targets through vibrating sights, firing in short bursts to avoid overheating their guns. The smell of cordite mixed with engine oil and cold air. Losses mounted quickly. By the time the force reached Regensburg, more than a dozen bombers had already been shut down. Others were damaged but pressed on, their crews determined to reach the target. At 11:43 a.m., the lead aircraft released its bombs. Thousands of pounds of high explosive and incendiaries fell toward the Messerschmitt factory complex along the Danube. Bombing accuracy, measured by the standards of the time, was good. Assembly halls were hit. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed. Production was disrupted, though not stopped. Without landing in England, the Regensburg force turned south and continued toward North Africa, as planned. The Schweinfurt force, meanwhile, pressed deeper into Germany alone. It was here, over central Germany, that the Luftwaffe struck hardest. Wave after wave of fighters attacked. Ammunition ran low. Some gunners fired their last rounds and watched helplessly as enemy aircraft closed in. One B-17 lost 2 engines and struggled to maintain altitude. Another flew with its tail almost completely shot away, held together by twisted metal. When the Schweinfurt bombers finally reached their target at 2:57 p.m., they flew through intense flak. Black bursts filled the sky, rocking aircraft violently. Bombs fell across the ball-bearing plants and surrounding city. Fires spread quickly among wooden structures. The return journey was worse. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England that evening, the cost was staggering. 60 B-17s had been destroyed. More than 600 airmen were missing, wounded, or dead. It was the worst single-day loss the 8th Air Force had suffered to date. German commanders took note. The Americans had not turned back. They had reached their targets, and despite the losses, they would return. Over the following months, the scale of the American bombing campaign increased relentlessly. New airfields were built. Production of B-17s and B-24s surged. Crews were trained and replaced. Most importantly, long-range fighter escorts arrived. The P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks, and later the P-51 Mustang, capable of accompanying bombers all the way to Berlin and back. By early 1944, raids involving 700, 800, even 1,000 bombers became possible. On March 6, 1944, more than 800 bombers struck Berlin in daylight. German fighters rose to meet them, but now American escorts were there in force. The Luftwaffe suffered crippling losses. Experienced pilots killed faster than they could be replaced. Cities across Germany endured repeated attacks. Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Leipzig, and Berlin itself were hammered. Industrial output fell. Transportation networks were shattered. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and tanks alike. What German commanders had once laughed at, the idea that daylight bombers could survive and prevail, became an unavoidable reality. The B-17 Flying Fortress did not win the war alone. It was part of a vast, brutal system that included factories, training bases, intelligence officers, navigators, mechanics, and thousands of young men who climbed into the cold sky knowing the odds. Its success came at an enormous human cost, on both sides. By May 1945, Germany lay defeated. Its cities were scarred, its air force broken, its war economy in ruins. The legacy of the daylight bombing campaign remains complex and contested. It demonstrated industrial power on an unprecedented scale, reshaped air warfare, and hastened the end of the conflict. It also left behind immense destruction and loss of civilian life that cannot be ignored. Today, the surviving airfields are quiet. The skies are empty of contrails and flak bursts, but the memory remains of crews who flew into enemy territory day after day, of defenders who fought against overwhelming odds, and of a moment in history when the sky itself became a battlefield. The campaign did not end with a single raid, or even a single season. February 20th, 1944, Western Germany. The weather over England was marginal, low cloud clinging to the airfields and a cold wind blowing from the North Sea. Despite this, takeoffs began before dawn. This operation had a name already circulating quietly among planners, Operation Argument. It would later be remembered by another name, Big Week. More than 1,000 American bombers were committed on the first day alone, supported by hundreds of escort fighters. The targets were no longer isolated factories, but the integrated structure of German aircraft production itself. Assembly plants, engine works, airframe facilities, and airfields where fighters were built, repaired, and flown. The strategic logic was clear and ruthless. German cities had absorbed punishment and continued functioning. But the Luftwaffe, the shield defending those cities, was a finite force. Aircraft could be replaced. Experienced pilots could not. That morning, as the bomber streams crossed the Rhine, German command faced a dilemma it could no longer avoid. If fighters rose to intercept, they would face not just defensive guns, but swarms of American escorts. If they stayed grounded, the bombers would devastate production unopposed. They chose to fight. The air battles that followed stretched across hundreds of miles and thousands of cubic miles of sky. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs ranged ahead of the bombers, sweeping airfields and engaging German fighters before they could form up. Over Leipzig, Oschersleben, Brunswick, and Gotha, bomber formations pressed on steadily, absorbing flak and scattered fighter attacks, but rarely breaking apart. B-17 crews noticed the difference immediately. Fighters stayed with them longer. Attacks from the front were disrupted or broken off entirely. Where once German interceptors had attacked in disciplined waves, now many engagements dissolved into chaotic turning fights at altitude. Losses still occurred. Bombers burned and fell. Crews bailed out or went down with their aircraft, but the balance was shifting. By the end of Big Week on February 25, 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of fighters and, more critically, a large portion of its remaining veteran pilots. German aircraft production, paradoxically, would recover numerically later in the year. Pilot quality would not. From this point forward, daylight bomber streams increasingly controlled the timing and terms of engagement. May 8, 1944, Central Germany. Spring brought longer days and clearer weather. It also brought a new phase of the air war. With the invasion of Western Europe approaching, bomber targets shifted again. Rail yards, bridges, fuel depots, and troop concentrations came under sustained attack. The goal was not merely destruction, but paralysis. The B-17, originally designed for high-altitude precision bombing, proved adaptable. Crews flew through thick cloud using radar aiming. They bombed marshalling yards repeatedly, turning rail hubs into twisted steel and cratered ground. German repair crews worked constantly, often under renewed attack the following day. Fuel became scarce. Fighter units flew fewer training hours. Pilots went into combat with minimal experience. Aircraft sat idle for lack of aviation gasoline. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. By then, the Luftwaffe could mount only limited opposition. German commanders later acknowledged that the air war had already been lost before the first landing craft reached the beaches. The bombers continued east. 3 February 1945, Berlin. The winter sky was clear and brutally cold. More than 900 bombers approached the German capital in daylight, escorted by fighters that ranged freely above and ahead of them. Flak was heavy, but increasingly inaccurate. German fighter response was fragmented. Bombs fell across rail centers, government districts, and industrial zones. Fires burned across the city. For many crews, this was not their first visit to Berlin. Some had been there half a dozen times or more. The city no longer represented an untouchable center of power. It was simply another target on a long list. By the spring of 1945, resistance collapsed rapidly. Bombing missions continued until the final weeks of the war, often directed at transportation choke points and remaining fuel stocks. On 25 April 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River. Germany surrendered unconditionally on 7 May 1945. The daylight bombing campaign was over. In total, the 8th Air Force flew more than 360,000 sorties. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in combat. Tens of thousands became prisoners of war. German civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and vast areas of urban Germany were reduced to rubble. The B-17 Flying Fortress became one of the most recognizable weapons of the war, not because it was invulnerable, but because it endured. It carried the air war into the heart of a modern industrial state and forced a reckoning that reshaped military strategy forever. The outcome was decisive, but the legacy remains sobering. Strategic bombing demonstrated the reach of industrialized warfare and the thin line between military necessity and human cost. It shortened the war. It also left scars that lasted generations. Today, a few restored B-17s still fly, their engines rumbling with a sound that once meant danger and hope in equal measure. Inside their narrow fuselages, Visitors can still see the cramped positions where young men stood for hours in freezing air, far from home, trusting their aircraft, their crew, and each other. They are reminders, not of triumph alone, but of endurance, sacrifice, and the heavy price paid when nations decide their fate in the sky. This story is not only about machines or strategies, it is about those who lived and died within them, and about a moment in history when laughter turned to disbelief and disbelief to ruin. They are remembered,